In this video, we're going to talk about the Demilitarized Zone, better known as a DMZ. Now, this concept both falls within the scope of network security and network segmentation. So we're going to talk about it now because I'm going to spend some additional time talking about firewalls later in the course when we talk about network security. So what is a DMZ? Well, a DMZ is a perimeter network that's designed to be securely separated from the organization's internal private network. In other words, their intranet. So the intranet would be the internal LAN. So let's say, for example, I work for an insurance company and we have all of our people that are employed by that company working in an office. We have our internal network where we have our private files and everything else, our private email. That would be within our intranet. Now let's say that this insurance company also has a website like every single one does. Well, we want that website to be publicly available. So what do? We would typically put it in a DMZ if we were designing a network as a network administrator. And what it does is that it separates that web server so it's isolated away from our internal private network. And that's the whole purpose of the DMZ. And what we do with that is we allow people to access the web server, but they don't have access to our internal private network, our intranet. So it allows us to have network segmentation where people, for example, in this top diagram, and I'll talk about the difference between both of them, they can access our website from the internet. They go in, they can access it, and it can send data back out to them, but they cannot get into our intranet. So a DMZ is designed to allow untrusted users outside of our organization to access public resources. And when I say public resources, I'm talking about things such as our public website. So what is an untrusted user? Well, anybody that we don't know who they are, that's considered an untrusted user. So anybody on the internet, that should be considered somebody that we don't trust. And some common examples of different services that we would put in the DMZ. Well, I already stated a public website, an FTP server to download software. So for example, if we were a company that created laptops and we had driver downloads and we had software, we could put those in the DMZ. We could use a trivial FTP server and we could put a link on our website and allow people to download the drivers and the software and etc. Now, if we were a company that offered email services such as Gmail, we would typically put that server in a DMZ as well because we want all this stuff isolated from our intranet. Our intranet should be on a separate protected network, and that's the whole purpose of having a DMZ. It blocks users from gaining access into our internal network. Now, we can still access the web server, but they cannot get past our firewall and router. They can only get into the DMZ. Now, let's talk about the two different typical designs of a DMZ. The top one is called a three-legged design because the router is going to have three different interfaces. So let me go ahead and get my arrow tool ready. So we have this interface that connects in from our ISP, from their router, from the internet into our network. We have one that comes from our intranet, and then we have one that goes into the DMZ. So there are three prongs onto here. So that's why we call it three-legged. And that way, when somebody sends a request in from the outside, from the internet, it'll direct them into the DMZ and it'll take that request and it'll send it back out to them. If they try to go into our internal network, the firewall and the router will stop them. So that's a three-legged design. It only requires one firewall and one router. And typically you're going to see this combined, but it could be separated as well. Now, a back-to-back configuration, also called a screen subnet, this is a little bit of a different design. We utilize two firewalls and routers on the edge of our network. So what will happen is that the request will come through this firewall, and then they'll have access to the DMZ. But if they try to access past here, the second firewall will stop them. So this one requires us to have two firewalls/routers, whereas the top one only requires one. And I did firewall/router here as an example, but in many instances as well, you may see this with just a firewall. Now, in terms of firewalls, we're going to revisit firewalls in the network security section of the course. So that's what the DMZ is. That's its whole purpose. It's designed to allow us to have items on our network that we want to have publicly available, isolated away from our protected internal intranet network. So anyways, that's going to conclude this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not,